that it's a great loss for language diversity and blah, blah, blah. So all those things, there are multiple tech talks. You can go online and then you can listen to them. So this is slightly more advanced, but more basic. In sense, it is basic, but it deals with people who are interested in language endangerment and endangered languages. It deals with people, or it is addressed to people who are interested in pursuing their academics or their research with endangered language communities. So my topic is understanding language endangerment. So it's a very vague, very broad title that I've kept so that I can talk a lot of things that are associated with the endangered languages and language endangerment as a phenomena. So, so this will be the outline for my talk. So we will try to understand the phenomena called language endangerment by first understanding its metaphor. Then we'll be looking at what is the magnitude of the problem. How big is this problem? Is language endangerment really a big problem, like compared to that of, let's say, ecological loss or climate change? How big is this problem when we compare it to the six? Yes?
I'm just going to interrupt you 1 second. Oh, just recording.
Yangchen, your voice is not clear. What did you say?
Are you recording?
Yeah, I am. Yeah, I started it.
Okay.
Sorry.
No,
is it just me or is the screen unclear for everyone?
The bigger text is very much visible. It's the smaller things which are not very clear.
So I'm not on a HD screen. So if you are on a HD screen and my resolution is a non-HD, so over there seems to be some mismatch. Okay, and it's also, my video is also not on HD. So that's the resolution problem. So if there's anything on the slide that is not clear, just stop me and ask me there. Can you see all of you can see the things here, like the outline?
Yes, it's clear.
Okay. So as I told you, I'll be going through. I'll be understanding the problem from the metaphor that we use to conceptualize the problem. Then how big is this problem when we compare it to other ecological disasters that we are facing, and then how do we assess what is language endangerment? How do we assess the thing called language endangerment? So how do we do that? Are there any methods for assessment? So I'll be going through them slightly. Then I'll be talking to you about a few certain things. In fact, 3 things that are more important to people who are interested in working with endangered language communities. Could be for anything from documentation to description to revitalization. So these are certain things that you will would want to know if you are dealing with endangered languages as such. So moving into my talk, the first thing is that all of us know that within linguistics we conceive language as a sort of a living organism. Okay, so this is an idea that has been since it has been there around since 17th century. But Darwin's Descent of the Man is one example of where this idea is clearly discussed. So Darwin goes on to say language, like organic beings, can be classed into groups, under groups, and they can be either naturally according to descent or artificially by other characters. Dominant languages and dialects spread widely and lead to gradual extinction of other tongues. So languages going extinct is not something new. We have known it for a while now, and then we have experienced it also for a while now, and it has also been recorded in various literatures for a long time now. But the thing is, this metaphor is something that is very new. We consider within linguistics, especially within language endangerment as a discipline, or endangered linguistics, as some would like to call it, language is seen as life, not just by linguists, but by also by policymakers and also by international bodies like UNESCO. All of us assume that language works and functions like life or a living organism, and then we set upon to deal with issues of endangerment. So, for example, since I consider it a living organism, it becomes possible for us to talk of evolution, life, vitality, endangerment, and death of a language as if languages are real living things. So language endangerment within this biological metaphor is thus a theoretical construct that a wide range of people try and use and to understand reality. So how big is this problem? Now, there is one interesting thing that crossed 2007 indicates that 95% of the world's languages are endangered. to some degree, but that leaving at that leaves only 5% of languages, which includes English and some of the other major Indian languages like Tamil, Malayalam, Telugu, Kannada, Hindi, Marathi, and all those other languages. Now, but if you compare it in contrast with other things that are endangered in the world, since we have already started to look at it as a living organism, if I compare it to other living organisms of reasonably equal size, like birds or mammals, I will see that language is more endangered than the birds or the mammals. For example, right now we are looking at somewhere around, this is a 2003 paper from a very famous biologist. He says that there are more extinct languages than there are more extinct mammals and birds. So you can see it on the screen here. So this is where, if it is unclear, I'll just read this out. So as of 2003, Sutherland's analysis points out that there are 4.5% of described languages that are endangered. On the other hand, only 1.3% of described birds are endangered, and mammals are only at 1.9%. So this clearly shows that languages going extinct is much higher than, let's say, birds or mammals. Now, even though the loss is much higher than what is seen in biological and ecological systems, there is not a lot of public awareness on language endangerment. We see a lot of protests to save the environment. We see a lot of protests to save to protest against climate change, but we do not have anything like Fridays for Future. Like, we do not have a Fridays for Language campaign to highlight the loss of linguistic diversity. So that's the problem. One, the magnitude of loss is much higher, and on the other side, we see that there is not a lot of public awareness on this. So this paper per se, the data that I'm quoting is per se from 2003, but from then on, we have gone to identify more languages. As of the recent Ethnologue 2019, they list around 8,000 languages. So we have, our diversity is counting, but our awareness on language loss awareness is pretty much low. So what is language endangerment? Is there any acceptable definition for language endangerment? If you ask me, not just if you ask me, if you ask any linguist, we won't be able to give you any particular set of definition or a particular definition to say this is language endangerment. But we have identified a certain things that are common across, or that are regular, rather statistically regular across all endangered languages. The first thing is going to be restricted use of language in the speech community, loss of prestige, disruption in native speakers' well-being, something that I'll talk more about later. Then reduction of linguistic complexity, again something that I'll talk more about in the later slides. Loss of competence, again I'll talk more about it in the later slides. Disrupted intergenerational transmission. Disrupted intergenerational transmission is basically when the language is not passed on to the youngest most member of the community. That is the children who are learning to speak. If the language is not passed on to them, then there is a disruption in the intergenerational transmission. So, and every healthy language is supposed to have a perfect intergenerational transmission, where the youngest of the community also knows to speak the language and learns to speak the language. Then it gradually moves to the parental, then to the grandparental, and to the great-grandparental generation. So all of these people know how to speak the language, or learning, since the youngest member is learning, and others know how to speak the language. So this is called as intergenerational transmission. So when there is a disruption in this, when the kids stop learning the language, that's called a disruption. So that disruption is something that is very commonly noted. Then other thing is that what we have also noted is that if the speakers, total number of native speakers for a particular language is 10,000, and if there are only 4,000 speakers that are speaking it, then there is also a loss. So there is also loss of language. So within a particular family, there can be intergenerational transmission maintained strictly, but at the community level, there is no intergenerational transmission. So again, a dwindling speakers population is also a very clear indication of language endangerment. So the restricted use of language in the speech community here refers to the idea of domains of language. So there is an idea that there are certain domains in which a language is used. If the language use is restricted to a few domains, then it is believed that the language is endangered. But it's this restricted use of language in the speech community is again a very problematic statement. We'll see how things are assessed, why this becomes a problem in the next slides as we go on. The other thing is loss of prestige. Now, the loss of prestige is a phenomena, or rather it's a cause, But what you measure when you want to measure loss of prestige is you measure attitudes. So you talk of language attitudes and you try to measure whether people or whether the native speakers have a native, whether do they have a positive or a negative attitude towards the language. If they have a negative attitude towards the language, it is because the language have lost its prestige. So language, let's say, has a value in the market. Let's say each language has a value in the market. That the language that I speak now, that I communicate with all of you now, has one of the maximum market in the has one of the maximum market value in the world. So this gives me power. This gives me a lot of economic wealth. This also gives me a lot of cultural opportunities. On the other hand, if I'm going to speak a language which is only spoken by, let's say, 2,000 people, it is going to be very difficult to have any market value for the language. Neither is there going to be any economically productive in terms of modern senses. Okay, in terms of modern economic production activities, there's going to be little economic productive value for those languages. So in those situations, the languages then lose prestige. So one more very linguistic context that we can speak of, if languages do not have grammar, if languages do not have a dictionary, that can also be perceived as a lack of prestige. Now, the lack of prestige is noted when you give the same language that does not have a dictionary or a grammar. When you give it to that, you will find that actually the prestige of the language goes up. So linguists' own work on describing languages also boost the language prestige, especially in endangered languages. It does make a big impact if you go around and show that my language also has a dictionary. So this is one thing that we need to understand of prestige. So I will stop here, and if there is any questions that I need to ask, if any of you have to ask, you can ask me now.
None so far.
Okay. And am I speaking too fast?
Slightly.
Slightly. Okay. Is there anything that someone needs a clarification here, that you missed it out because I'm speaking too fast?
Anybody? No, all clear, Karthick.
Okay.
Oh, there's one question.
Yes.
Shubham.
Is it a chat?
No, it's a raised hand. Shubham, unmute yourself.
Hello.
Shubham.
Is it correct to use market value as like language as an enterprises and denote market value?
It is not correct. Again, it is a metaphor that I use to understand prestige. So what I mean by market value is basically if the language gives me economic opportunity, if the language gives me employment opportunity, then I think that language has a market value. Okay, in the larger context. But I do not think of language as enterprises as such. I do not use that. I do not associate with that metaphor. But people have also used another metaphor called language as empires. So that's also there. So the big ones keep on growing and colonizing the small ones' lands. So that's in one sense another market value, rather a colonial value. Is it answer? Does it answer you, Shubham? Check.
Shubham says yes.
Okay, thank you.
And we have one change for today. As there is a lot of echo, we'll be doing questions via chat today.
Okay.
We have one more question for you.
Yes, please.
Agniba wants to know, can lack of script affect prestige associated with the language?
Yes, they do. So in India, if you come across, across the length and the breadth of India, there is one thing that I commonly come across is people make distinction of two types when it comes to language. They call one type as language, as Bhasha, and then they call, in the North Indian Hindi setting, and then they call the other type as Boli. One of the major distinctions between this Bhasha and Boli is that one has a script and the other doesn't have a script. Now, the same distinction is also visible in, let's say, in down south. People make two distinctions: Moli, which refers to language, and Peche, which refers to speech. So here again, the distinction is script. So people here often ask me as a language documentationist, why do you study my language? This language doesn't have any script. It is not even a language. So why do you want to study? So this really indicates distinction of a lack of prestige when there is no script. It is a problem, but again, it's a problem that comes from a particular colonial mindset that I'll again talk to you in the later slides. Is it clear?
Yes.
Okay.
Karthik, one question.
Huh.
Will it be possible for you to read the questions in group chat, or is it okay if I read them out to you?
Just 1 minute. I will figure it out.
If you have to toggle, then I'll read it.
It's better you can read it because I can see it on my screen,
Okay.
but it takes a bit of my screen away too.
Because there's still some echo, I'll take my speech.
Okay.
There's one more question.
Yes.
Will you explain reduction of linguistic complexity?
Yes, I will do that at the end. There is a we will talk about it much more clearly than this.
Okay, great.
Okay. So I'll just move on, and then we can take the questions as and when they come up in between. So, guys.
Yes.
Then one consequence of language endangerment is called as language shift or death or language loss, a situation where the language is no more spoken as a first language. Now, this definition is slightly problematic because of the fact that there are languages that have become extinct, but people are trying to revive it. But linguists or people who deal with endangered linguistics often treat these languages as a special type of languages because they deserve a special attention from linguists too. So for common sense, let us assume the language death or a language shift. Let's say the language death means a situation where the language is no more spoken as a first language. So this is the common thing that I'm going with. If my voice is breaking, I'll make it more slow, but I think my network strength is fine.
Your voice.
Yeah, voice is breaking on my side also. I can't hear you guys.
Oh, okay. Check. Thanks.
Your voice is clear.
Okay, thank you. Okay, then I'll move on to the next slide. So the one of the most easiest thing that people use to understand language endangerment is a concept called vitality. Language vitality is like measuring your language. It's like measuring your health. So the term vitality clearly comes from the concept that we have borrowed from medical sciences or life sciences. I assume that there are certain vitals like my blood pressure or like my heartbeat or like my salinity content in my blood and my things are like that. And then I try to try to find out vitalities for language and I measure them. Again, it's a metaphor that comes out of the biological systems metaphor, the language as life. Now here, the vitality should be understood not as discrete points, but as a continuum. So you do not have any discrete points in this. So in the earlier slide, you must have seen that there is extinct, critical, endangered, vulnerable, distinct points. Which people have highlighted for various reasons. We will see why so in the things. But to really conceive of this vitality, we should see it like this. So at the one end of the spectrum, safe languages like Hindi and English are there. And at the other end of the spectrum, there are extinct languages like present Greater Andamanese. So now this is a almost extinct language, which is almost on the verge of death. And there are, apart beyond this continuum, there is also, you have languages that are completely dead. So this is a continuum with stages that are overlapping to each other. Think of language vitality as clear-cut contained values, but rather as a continuum. So that's one thing that we should understand. So now moving on to the rest. Next, there are quite a few assessment methods that tries to assess language vitality. A few of them are, to begin with, graded intergenerational deception scale, Fishman. Stephen Wurum's 5 levels: classification and terminology of language endangerment classification, and terminology for degree of language endangerment, Michael Cross; UNESCO's language vitality and endangerment; expanded greater intergenerational disruption scale, Lewis and Simmons. This is the one that Ethnologue uses. And there is a new scaling method in which is available for a lot of languages. It is called as the Catalogue of Endangered Languages. It is often called LCAT. I don't know why it is called LCAT. It's not really an abbreviation as such. So these are the 6 major methods which people use to classify endangered languages. I will be talking about all of the 6, but I'll be concentrating on the last 3 more, because a lot of them there is a lot of already made assessment available for all these 3. Now, for example, just 1 minute. So, so some of you might see my screen. So for those of you, I'll just read it out. Fishman was the first one to use to devise a scale as such to understand language language disruption. He at that point of time he called it language disruption. Now he identified just 3 parameters to do this. 4 parameters to do this. Literacy is not being bulleted. The first parameter that he used is called domains of use. The second parameter that he used is called users bake or speakers generation. The third parameter that he uses is literacy, and the fourth parameter that he uses is intergenerational transmission. Now,
Karthik, if I may interrupt.
Yeah, this thing is not clear.
Yeah, it's not clear. Will you read out the descriptions too?
Yeah, so I will read out the descriptions. There are Fishman identifies 8 levels of. Level 1 is called as level 1 is in education, work, mass media, government at the nationwide level. So it is a language that is used for all purposes, and it is used by all for every purpose. So this is a language like Hindi or like English, which is completely safe. The level 2, the language is used for local and regional mass media and governmental services. Yes, someone's mic is on. Okay, thank you. These are languages. The level 2 languages can be conceived as languages like Bangla or Tamil, where we have local and regional use, and it is also used in the government services. And the level 3 languages or those languages that is used in local and regional, but only by insiders and outsiders. It is not used by government. Okay, is there any? And there are level 4, which is there is literacy in the language. It is transmitted by literacy. And there is level 5. Okay, is my voice breaking, guys?
Karthik, if I may.
Yeah.
Yeah, can you just go back?
Okay, I am unable to hear you properly. Can you put it on chat?
Okay, yeah.
Can I send my slides to you guys as a?
Yes, please do that, and we'll change the slides for you. Okay. Also, could you increase your volume a bit?
Yeah, I could increase. So, okay, how do I send you the slides? Can one of you just tell me that?
Email it to us, and then we'll share screen.
Okay. Just 1 minute. I'm also increasing my.
It suddenly got better, by the way. Did you do something with your screen?
It suddenly got better. Yeah. No, it's basically HD. Yes. The thing is that I'm not telecasting on HD, so it's not on high definition.
Because rest of your screens were clear. This was scrambled. Now this got clear.
Yeah, this is clear.
It's clear?
Yes.
It is cleared. Okay, then I'll just run around with it. Run along with it.
Yes, please.
I will. In the meantime, it's basically the internet. Okay. So in the meantime, I'll just send the slide to one of you, so you can just share it along. I don't know how to share it on chat. That's a problem. Sorry. Oh, the internet is stable. Okay. Okay. So thank you. I'll just send it to Ojasvi. Please, Ojasvi, please send it on to our rest.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So since the screen is clear, so the level 1 languages are languages that are completely safe, and level 8 languages are the languages that are in great danger. So he doesn't give any labels to them. So the level 8 languages are languages where there are only few speakers are remaining, and there is no intergenerational transmission. So you can see that the speakers of the generation or of the members of the grandparents generation. So that's where you see that there is no additional new addition to the there's no new addition to the language. There's no new speakers learning it. There's no young speakers learning it. So if you see the seventh, the child generation 7, it slightly varies. The elders know it, but they don't transmit it. Okay, and 6, the language is used orally by all generation, and is being learned by the children as the first language. So it's like a level from level 1 to level 8. You move on along grades, and at the last level 8, it's like almost there towards extinction. Now this is graded intergenerational disruption scale. So in this scale, one thing that Fishman identifies is used even till today, and that is called as intergenerational transmission. Now intergenerational transmission is often considered by endangered language linguists and people who do language assessment as a pulse of the body. So if there is no intergenerational transmission, then you can clearly say that this language is severely endangered. Again, a term that we will see what it means, or rather, there is no new speakers being added to it. So it is almost in the verge of extinction. So that is the main important contribution of Fishman. Now, I move on to the next slide, Wurum then takes up this Fishman's concepts, and he is trying to give them labels with which we can easily associate with. So level 1, level 2, level 3 are seems to be rather abstract. So he tries to give us labels. Now these labels, he gives us 5 labels, and he calls them 5 levels. Now he is not worried about languages that are safe and that are thriving, but he's only worried about languages that can be endangered and that are potentially endangered. So it is like he starts his levels from potentially endangered languages that are at a social economic disadvantage, under heavy pressure from a large language, and beginning to lose child speakers. So this is the first level that he identifies. Then he calls something which is endangered languages have few or no children. Then have the youngest good speakers are 50 years old, seriously endangered languages. Morbid, only a handful of good speakers are left, and most of them are really old. And extinct languages, no speakers left. Now, within Wurum's scale, one thing that we need to notice is that he emphasizes a lot on the speakers generation, even though he talks of socio-economic disadvantage and pressure from larger families. At the beginning, he actually doesn't take it along to the next level. So the next of the 4 levels does not refer to any of these things. So his scale is mainly focused on speakers generational, and again, a continuation of intergenerational transmission. Then another very famous linguist who in fact sensitized a lot of us on endangered languages, Michael Cross. Can you guys see this clearly? Okay. Now, Michael Cross takes Wurum's labels. There's a question. Okay.
Can you see the question, or should I read it out?
Yeah. I'm seeing the question. Just one minute.
Okay.
Okay. Yes. So to answer to Shakshi's question, within GIDS, which is Fishman's method, literacy is a very important mark. Rather, literacy is like the fence sitter. It decides whether the language is going to be on a safer side or whether it's going to be on the endangered side. So for Fishman, literacy becomes a very important tool. But again, that is something that is not really necessary. I will talk about it again in the later slides, because this importance to literacy is something that is recurring, and you will find it to be recurring even in an expanded graded intergenerational transmission scale too. So Fishman considers it to be very important, but I don't personally. I'll talk about it in the later slides for why so. Okay, so I'll now continue with cross scales. Cross brings about this sort of a gradification in the category called safe and stable. Now he doesn't do a lot of changes to Wurm's levels. He's only going to rename certain things. So he calls potentially endangered as unstable and eroded, and then again he changes this. The one on the topmost, he says that there is safe languages. Then he calls them. Then there are stable languages. But again, what is the real distinction between safe and stable? He doesn't really discuss them. He calls the stables ones also as endangered, and then you then go on to say unstable and eroded languages. He again emphasizes on speakers generation or nothing else. So all over the things we can see that his is again scales are marked by the speakers generation or not by other forms that are visible in endangered languages, not by other distinctions that are visible in endangered languages. So this is again a very common thing that you can see between Cross and Wurm. Cross basically just renames it. That's all. Just renames the levels, and that's it. He doesn't do anything else. Now to continue, so after Cross, even though Cross discusses this in a paper in 2007, he has actually talked of it in early 2000s in a symposium. So that is taken as a thing. After Cross, we can see that there is a very important UNESCO thing that comes out. It's called as language vitality and endangerment. So the language vitality and endangerment is a set of experts who are brought together to frame clear vitals that they can measure. Now, as I pointed out, people again, since they conceptualize language as living organisms, they're looking for vitals, vital signs of life. Now, those vital signs of life, they say there are going to be 9 vital signs of life. The first one is intergenerational language transmission. Again, something that is borrowed from absolute number of speakers. So they want to see what is the absolute number of the speakers population, and then they talk of then they talk of proportion of speakers within total population. Then they take the speakers base within the total population. How many % of people speaks it within the particular population? Then they talk of loss of existing language domains. So they bring in the concept of language domains. This is the first thing. This is the first time that people bring in the concept of language domain. Then again, they also add a new thing is how do languages react to new domains? For example, social media is a new domain that for most of us, and do we use our language in social media? Again, they're also trying to understand that. Then they're asking a very important question: how much material or what is the quality of the material do you have for language education and literacy? And the next one is, do you have government and institutional backing? What does the government and institutions language attitudes and policies? Do you have official status, and what are all those governmental support that you get? And then the eighth, does the community members introduce a positive attitude? Do they have a positive attitude to the language? And the last one is not really a vitality of language, but rather it is a marker, or it is rather an indicator for linguists and policymakers to decide on which language should be prioritized and then what priority should be done. So that's amount and quality of documentation. So these 9 vitals and this UNESCO scale is one of the widely used language vitality and endangerment, one of the widely used language vitality index. Now, when people refer to language vitality index, most of the people often refer to this scale. Now, this scale is published in the form of an atlas of an endangered languages, and it was published in 2009, and it is available online for all of you to go and check. It is based on this scale that we say India has one of the largest number of endangered languages in the world. So the number keeps on varying between 198 and 197 languages. So I can give feedback to it, and then UNESCO basically modifies it according to the feedback. Now, if you have seen this again, certain things are continued: intergenerational transmission, speakers proportion, literacy is continued, but certain things are new. So the use of domain as such is very unique here, and the use of attitude is again very unique here. These are two things that linguists have known for a while, that attitudes affect languages, and this is the first time that any language vitality index actually takes attitude into measurement. So these are the first. This is the first assessment method that rather expands the scope of understanding language endangerment. But again, certain things, certain phenomena that we have noted already are not being noted here. For example, people do not talk of loss of fluency. We do not talk of loss. We do not talk of reduction in linguistic structures. We do not talk of those things here. Now I will show you the next two slides. Might not be clear. So if they're not, you have to tell me. It's fine. So okay, fine. It's fine. UNESCO again has a problem. They do not clearly adhere to the standards of labels, and they do not clearly provide grades. For example, the factor 2 in UNESCO is absolute number of speakers. There is a general assumption that if the language has less than 10,000 speakers, it is going to be endangered. Now, this assumption might be true for a certain European view, from a certain European view, and from a certain perspective, but it is not the same when it comes to India. We have a lot of small languages, literally, virtually very small, like the two of the languages that I worked on for my PhD had less than 3,000 speakers, and then they were fairly strong than what UNESCO calls them. So, and again, UNESCO doesn't gradify or doesn't really give labels or doesn't tell you how to interpret this second vitality that they speak of, absolute number of speakers. They just tell you that if the language is less than 10,000 speakers, it is endangered. So, which is something which I disagree with. Now, UNESCO maintains one thing as common: they have grades, but the labels are not consistent across all the let's say all the 5 parameters, or all the 8 parameters. The one parameter does not have anything, does not have any classification within them, but these are not common across all the labels. If you look into the document, you will find that they are not. But can we use them as common labels? Because in general parlance, what people will call as definitely endangered languages will be basically a set of all these things in grade 3. So all the things that are in grade 3 are put together and called a definitely endangered. But people, when you see the atlas, you will only see the first vitality, that is intergenerational transmission, and that's what you see. So most of the documents, when they refer to us, there are many critically endangered languages in India, they only take into account one vitality, that is the first vitality, that is intergenerational transmission. So instead of going through it, all of them one by one, I'll tell you. I'll tell you how these people grade it. So now, for the grade 1, which is for the grade 5, which is safe, they assume that it should be universal. So if all speakers speak the language, if intergenerational transmission is uninterrupted, then the language is safe. Again, the same thing if you come to absolute number of speakers. If everyone in the community speaks that language, then the language is safe. Again, if you look into domains, if everyone uses the language in every domain, again, the language is in universal use, then it is completely safe. Now, if you look at extinct languages, it is nil. So the distinction between the 5 and 0 is basically universal to nil. And within this universal to nil is what UNESCO brings you this other 4 grades. So there are 6 grades, and within this, at 1 is universal use, universal, everyone speaks, everyone uses it in all domains. and that's sort of universality that you see, universal use or rather total use. And at the extinct level, you see there is no use at all. So there is nil, any use at all. Now this is the level with between, this is the 2 points between which their continuum is constructed for all the eight vitals. Now the first one is intergenerational transmission. You can see, I'll just go through one and maybe a few more. Intergenerational transmission is uninterrupted. Everyone speaks. Most speak, but not all children speak the language as their first language. Again, from all we have come down to most. Then the language from most we have gotten, there is a sudden drop to no longer being learned by speakers. So again, there is some sort of a gap between most and no children learning the language. And then severely endangered is when there is language is spoken only by grandparents' generation or older generation. Again, parental generation is not taken into account here. Critically endangered is again only when great grandparents' generation speak it, and the language is not used in everyday interaction. And extinct is when there is no one speaks. So again, these grades are also not a natural progression, but rather sudden abrupt jumps. So again, as I pointed out, these are certain points in a continuum. There might be something overlapping, but these are certain points in continuum. So their points in continuum also doesn't necessarily flow. So the points in continuum have abrupt jumps from one to the others. From all to most to no is how the jumps happen. Now, similarly, you can see the same thing in number 3. All speakers speak. This is the language proportion. All speakers speak the language. Nearly all speak the language. From all, it becomes nearly all. Then from nearly all, it becomes majority speak. Then minority speaks. Very few speaks, and none speaks. So you can see here that the grade, or rather the grade, is gradually decreasing. But that is not true for vital 1. So this is something that is a problem with UNESCO's language vitality and endangerment. And this is probably a methodological challenge too, because we can't really quantify these things, but this has been noted by quite a few people. Now, the few things that UNESCO takes seriously, this slide is going to be slightly problematic, because even I tried to fit in a lot of things in this. Now, language attitude of the state and language attitude of the community. Now, language attitude of the state is often called as language policy. Now, for a state like India, even though we do not have a clearly well articulated language policy, there is actually a language policy in action. So we have a language policy that is in practice. I'll just read the 7, the top level, which is safe, grade 5. All languages are protected. This is not in India. All languages are not protected. Coming to grade 4, which is unsafe, minority languages are protected primarily as language of private domain. The use of the language is prestigious. Again, here they recognize that people should speak the language. The nation recognizes that people should speak the language, but they think that the nation has a policy, has decided that it should be only spoken in private domains only, and not in public domains. Public domains are governmental services. Like if you can speak in, let us say, Gurung, there's a language called Gurung in Sikkim and Darjeeling, and if you can speak this language, and if an MP can speak this language in the parliament, then that's the language being used in a public domain. In India, we cannot actually do those things. Even in the last parliament sessions, even for a language like Tamil, there was an opposition to be used in the financial debates. So that's an example in India. Then there are no explicit policy exists for minority language. The dominant language prevails in the public domain. This is more like India. This is the definitely endangered state, where we do not have any articulated policy. The dominant language takes the center stage when it comes to public domain. And like Hindi, how Hindi and English does in Indian languages, in Indian scenario. Then the grade 2, again, can we call it severely endangered? We can call it severely endangered. Is government encourages assimilation onto the dominant language. There is no protection for minority languages. So there is no clear protection for there is no protection for minority languages, and I'm indirectly or rather passively encouraging assimilation into the dominant language. For most of the tribal languages, again a classification that is there is a construct of our own. Many Western speakers, Western scholars really take offense to the word tribal languages, but it's a classification that we use. For most of the tribal languages, this is the state. Government passively encourages them to assimilate with the dominant languages. And the grade 1, which might be critically endangered, is the dominant language is the sole official language. Others are neither recognized nor protected. And here there is an active assimilation. So the state actively tells you, the state actively encourages you to learn the official language, and then that is the only language that is protected, and the rest of them are not. And grade 0 is going to be, and grade 0 is going to be when minority languages are completely prohibited. Okay, so this is something that we do not find in India, but there are quite a few languages, quite a few nations which have this. Similarly, I can also assess the speakers' attitudes. Now, those are again going to be all speakers have positive attitudes. Most members, again, there is going to be most, all, most, many, some, only a few, no one cares. So positive attitude starts with all, safe, some, most, unsafe, definitely endangered. Many speakers support language maintenance, but the rest do not bother about it. Only some support language maintenance. There is some have positive attitudes towards the language that is severely endangered. Only a few support the language that is critically endangered, and none prefers it. That is almost like an extinct. So again, the labels here, the UNESCO doesn't really work on the labels, but what they concentrated more on is the grade 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and 0. So the grades are separated again from universal to none. So these are the things, and then the 9th one is on the availability of documentation and description. If the documentation and description is available in very high amount, then it is safe. If there is no, then that's the language you should start with. So this is UNESCO. This is one of the most readily available scale that you find in India, that you find on the web. The next one is Ethnologue. A lot of linguists and a lot of people who research on languages have actually seen Ethnologue. And then you find a small row in the language information called language status. Now, Ethnologue has 11 status. One has A and B, and these are called from level 0 to level 10. They're classified as level 0 to level 1, level 10. It again takes into account a lot of other things. So it is an expansion of graded intergenerational transmission. So they do follow Fishman's classification of classifying even the safe languages. So international languages that are used for all international purpose, like English, or some examples would be French, and national language and languages that are used at the national level for all for everyday purpose, that is going to be Hindi or English in India. Provincial are those that we find in states, Bangla, Marathi, Tamil, Telugu, and Malayalam. Wider communication is something that is not common in India, but for example, a variety of non-standard that a lot of us can speak and understand with each other is a language that is used for wider communication, and there is a language that we use only for educational purposes that we can also find in a few nations, and there are languages that are developing, where the safe to the endangered is going to be marked. Now, if you can see this developing, you can see that the language is in vigorous use, with literature in standardized form being used by some, though this is not widespread and sustainable. So literacy again begins a very important thing. If you look into the vigorous, now you can see that the literature, attaining literacy is the most important thing. If you have literacy, you're a developing language, and if you're not in literacy, you're not. You're a vigorous language. If you do not have literacy, you're again a vigorous language. Again, this is something that you see from Fishman being carried forward. And this is also very common for vigorous use for Egypt. And then you go down, and then you see that there is threatened languages used all in face-to-face communication by all generation, but it is starting to lose uses. So intergenerational transmission is being questioned here. Then shifting, when it is not being transmitted to children. Moribund, only great-grandparent generation uses the language. Nearly extinct, only remaining few speakers can use the language. Dormant, it's only some sort of an identity and not really used. And extent is when it is no longer used at all. So here also you can see that even though there are a longer scale or longer grades, the moment they come to endangered languages, the grades shift rapidly. From threatened, you move to shifting, from shifting to morbid. So beginning to lose a few speakers, the shifting is again an abrupt translation of almost no children is being learned. And then great grandparent generation is morbid. So again, an abrupt transmission. And again, do not take into account, let's say, a language that is being orally thrived, they call it threatened. They call it threatened or vigorous, but 6A to 10 is generally considered as endangered languages within the EGIT scale, within the Ethnologue scale. And again, this is one of the most widely available scales that people use. And another scale that now that has recently come to a lot of use is Catalogue of Endangered Languages. The Catalogue of Endangered Languages is a joint venture between University of Hawaii and Google. So they have a lot of languages listed in them, and then you can just simply see them when you say when you Google endangered languages. This is a site that you will often land today. Now, this people, the Hawaii people, LCAT, the project was called LCAT. They use only 4 parameters to classify the languages. The absolute number of speakers. Again, they think that the language should not have a lot of speakers. Intergenerational transmission. Decreasing number of speakers. Intergenerational transmission, decreasing number of speakers, decreasing domains of use. So I just saw Sakshi's question. I will come to that. Now, again, they do not discuss about a lot of other things. They do not take into account language attitude to classify endangered languages. They also do not take into account what is the language policy what is the language policy in the state in which the language is spoken. They do not take that into account. So in comparison with the 3 most widely used, we will find that UNESCO has a lot of features that are very important to be considered. EGITS has the widest possible range of languages evaluated, and the Catalogue of Endangered Languages tries to classify languages from a very narrow objectified perspective, that too especially of the living organism. This living organism metaphor is what that takes or what that makes us talk of these things as vitals, what we call as parameters as vitals. So people think that it is enough to understand language or assess language only from its vitals, and that is enough. So that's what most of the things is. Now, are the assessment methods safe, or the assessments are adequate? Are they really telling us anything? Actually, to be very clear, no. Almost all scales do not capture 3 commonly observed phenomena: disruption in native speakers' well-being, reduction of linguistic complexity, loss of competence. The loss of competence is something that related to Sakshi asked, so I'll just come to that. So they do not even address this. They do not even go near this. So there are a lot of other parameters that these things do not even look into. Now, what problems do they have? The very important problem that all of them have is a monolingual idea of a language use. It's a very European, rather than Anglophone-centric use, that one language should be used for all purposes by everyone. This is what you see in most of the scales. And if that is not there, then they don't think it is ideal situation, and then they classify the languages as endangered. Then the other things that they do, almost all the scales do, is they give an undue advantage to writing, or rather to literacy. Writing as a tool or literacy as a tool is given undue advantage. Most of the scales, especially EGITS, gives a lot of importance to literacy, so that it marks the boundary, like it marks the boundary between safe and endangered languages. And except UNESCO, almost all of them decontextualize the language from speakers' socio-economic reality. So they are not worried about the language policy, they are not worried about the social and economic condition. Now, these are certain things that they really have a problem. So these are like real ideological problems that are very common with these methods. Now, before I move on to address these 3 commonly observed phenomena in endangered languages. I will take some questions and I will rush through them. I think it is already 3, if I'm not wrong. So, is there any other questions on the assessment methods? I will talk about the heritage speakers and proficiency levels more. That is there in the that is there in the next slides. Yes. Yeah, please. Huh? Sorry, I couldn't hear you properly. Margaret Foley doesn't necessarily talk of assessing language endangerment. She talks of orality. But she doesn't. She has a linguistic vitality test. No, yeah, that's again loss of competence. They assess loss of competence and not linguistic vitality test per se. So I will talk of that in the loss of competence slide. So it's about individual speakers' competence and not about the language vitality per se. So that's the Margaret Foley's method. In fact, it's not Margaret Foley's method alone. It's a work of the Australian government along with the indigenous languages. So we will come to that shortly in the language competence. Is there any other question? It is okay for now. No more issues with that. Okay, should I move on, Ojashwi? If there is no question, should I move on?
Yes, Karthik, please.
Okay. Yeah, it'll go. Huh? Just a minute. Yeah. Okay. So a few things that we come across when we come across language endangerment is loss of competence. Loss of competence is something that really strikes us. This is something that linguists should understand. Endangered language community itself, that every speaker is not an ideal speaker. We are always in this looking, or we always go looking for an ideal speaker for a purpose, but that is not really possible. So linguists and language documentationists across for a while have now understood that there is a lot of variation within competence levels of speakers. Now, some have also tried to quantify, and then some have also tried to assess the language competence of the speakers per se. For example, which the Mairaba just mentioned to us. So they use a lot of complex methods to understand what is the language competence of the speaker. For example, they do a lexicon recognition task, they will do a sentence recognition task, and then they will do a narration recognition, or rather a re-narration task. So this is what the RNLD method uses. So where they try to test individual speakers' competence, and then from that they try to assess the language competence per se. But again, it also poses a lot of problems, because what you're really testing is not necessarily the competence of the speaker as such, because you as an external, when you're trying to test the competence of the speaker, there are a lot of other things involved into it, whether the speaker understands the testing mechanisms or not, and all those things are involved to it. So do they necessarily give you the vitality of the language per se? No. And that's one of the reasons why the method of testing language fluency is not used a lot in language vitality testings that you see at the global level. But language competence is something that linguists should take into account, because this is something that will make you understand that you're not going to get a language data from everyone, and every language speaker is not interested with you. So the very first idea of competence loss is first identified by Nancy Doran in her work on South Gallic languages in the early 1970s. She gives her two concepts, fluent and semi-speaker. Now this is later expanded into a full-on typology by Grivel and Brett. They talk of multiple levels of competency. So they talk of fluent speaker, a speaker who is someone who is completely fluent, what we call as ideal speaker. A semi-speaker, introduced by Doran, is the most emblematic situation of language endangerment. It is a large category which includes all members of community, with appropriate receptive skills in language, but varying levels of protective skills. They understand the language, but they can't really use it at every domain. For example, some of these people can't use, semi-speakers can't use the language for ritualistic purpose, or they can't use the language to tell a folk tale, or they can't really use the language to fluently express their emotion, but they do use the language actively in everyday use. Then there is something else, terminal speaker, a very problematic term in the literature, but nevertheless it is used, is people who have passive knowledge of the language and very limited protective skill. So they can understand, but they can't even answer to simple questions. Sometimes reduced to frozen fixed expressions, yes, no, sort of a thing. And then there are the rememberers. So these are the speakers who may regain or reacquire some partial active use of language because of certain interactions. Like even language documentation itself can help people remember languages. This is something that we have noticed now in one of the languages that we are working in Sikkim. So people actively trying to learn the language by remembering what they know after the experience of working with the language documenter. Then there are these ghost speakers. Ghost speakers are those who deny that they know language. They know the language. They know the language to a linguist or to a documenter or to anyone who wants to information on the language, but they might probably have some competence level. The denialism has to be very clearly seen, is a very strong manifestation of a negative attitude towards the language and a deep rejection of any identity that is associated with the language. So this is the ghost speakers. And there are these neo speakers. Neo speakers are learners of endangered languages in the context of a revitalization program. So to answer to Sakshi's question, now heritage speakers fit into either a neo speaker domain if they are relearning the language, okay, or might also fix into the ghost speakers. You know they have some competence, but they refuse to tell it to you. That could be, again, they could be a ghost speaker. And they could also be rememberers. You just sit with them and then you talk to them about their language, and then you interact with them for a few days, and then they tell you they slowly and steadily at least regain a part of the language. So this is the rememberer stage. And a very commonly known speaker is the last speaker. This is not really a category assigned by the linguist based on any specific competence level, but this is rather very political and a social symbol. So the last speakers died. The last speaker is trying to save the language. The last speaker is looking for a linguist to collaborate. So these things have a lot of socio-political value to it. So this is something that linguists should understand when they collaborate with community speakers. So you can't expect every speaker to be a fluent speaker. The speaker's fluency is not really dependent on their individual skills. It is not because they are highly skilled, they are fluent. It is dependent on a lot of other things. For example, if a language is already not in use in everyday language, in everyday circumstances, then what you're looking at is that reduced level of competence. This reduced level of competence, when mixed with a very negative attitude towards language, could make a speaker a ghost speaker. Or this reduced level of competence, when mixed with a very high positive attitude towards language, will create a new speaker, might create a new speaker, person who is actively learning the language from whatever resources that are available. So this is something that the language, or rather a language documentation, should learn, or rather should know when they approach or when they deal with the endangered language community. So Shakshi, does this answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. So the other thing that is often left out is reduction of linguistic complexity. So very often linguists have seen that when you're looking into an endangered language, there's a lot of change, or rather there's a lot of variation that you get in the data. Now the variation in the data that you get is not necessarily a variation that is common to all language change. Now it is, again, I'm going to talk about Pellashori and Campbell's typification, not really a typology of changes that you see in endangered languages. Now these changes are often not explainable in terms of socioeconomic classes or sex or ethnicity. These changes do not actually bear any social meaning. So in a normal language which is not endangered, there is some social meaning. But in endangered languages, if you see a lot of variation, there is actually probably may not be any social meaning to that. Now, this is often described when there is no social meaning, but there is a change, language change, that is often described as a reduction in linguistic complexity. Many linguists have come across this in many works, and Paulo Sarai and Lily Campbell tries to create a type out of it. So there is a normal change that is common for all languages. There is overgeneralization of unmarked features. So marked features, for example, one of the languages that I worked in had a frequent occurrence of voiceless laterals. Voiceless laterals. Now, the voiceless lateral is a very marked feature. And it's also very difficult to produce. And what the speakers did is that they started to slowly and steadily replace this voiceless laterals with voiced laterals. So this was once described by Peter Ladefoged as a very unique feature in Dravidian languages, is now suddenly began to change, and people have started to overgeneralize unmarked voiced normal lateral for a voiceless lateral. So this is an example of that. And then sometimes what will happen is speakers will tend to also overgeneralize marked features. So marked features will become more common, even in places where unmarked features were there. So it's a form of exoticization of the language, but again, it comes in a particular language context situation, where can be. It's again a particular the dominant and the dominant use of dominant speakers are the ones who are then classifying you. Oh, you speak like this, la la la, blah blah blah. So this sort of things are also happening. So Paul C. and Campbell deals with this paper with a lot of examples from a lot of wide varieties of languages. Another thing that the law example or the lateral example that I talked of is also loss of reduction in phonological contrast. For example, most of the languages that I work on Indo-Aryan things, I've seen affricates and fricatives losing their distinctions. The affricate phoneme and the fricative phonemes have started to lose their distinctions. This is another example that you see. Sometimes the language can have both over generalization and under generalization in the same language, and that can also be used. And then there is something called as an act of reception. In the context of a minority language, we take or rather we receive certain things from dominant language, and then we use it in our own language. So this is very common in most of the languages that are associated with. So people don't want to be judged by their, let us say, by the dominant speakers. So they try to mimic more and more the dominant speakers in their speech forms. So this is called as act of reception. Again, it has been well described in a lot of languages. Then again, there is a preference towards analytic constructions over synthetic ones. Again, it is very clearly restricted to analytic languages and synthetic languages, not to us. Okay, so yes, and then there is something called as a syntactic reduction. You see a lot of syntactic reduction. One of the very important example that Lily, with a lot of literature describes is the loss of ergativity in Dirble, which is a very important thing. And then there is a stylistic shrinkage. So some of the languages that we work with here, we have seen a stylistic shrinkage. For example, only formulaic structures of the language are retained and not the rest. So everyday language is not used. Only this formulaic structure of the language, like in rituals, are used. And I've also seen with other languages, only everyday language is used, and the formulaic structures, formulaic things or verse like poetry like language is lost. So this is called a stylistic shrinkage. The stylistic shrinkage is also often associated with syntactic reduction. So if there is a syntactic reduction, then the language is bound to have a stylistic shrinkage. So this is again the reduction of linguistic complexity. So you see that the language complexity reduces. So just one more slide, I'll just hurry through it. One section is there. Another thing that we don't often talk about is the native speakers well-being. So this quote is a quote that I recently taken from Professor Anmita Abhi's Facebook post. It is on a native, it is about this death of a last speaker that she shares, and then she tells you that the last speaker is rather has struggled a lot despite all odds, and battered and bashed. You can see those words again, battered and bashed, and often lamented. So, so this thing, rather this description tells you that she's under a lot of pain, or the last speaker was under a lot of pain while she was interacting with Professor Anita Abbey. So this is from LICO. She writes it. This is about LICO. She writes it about on the death of the LICO. So language, especially endangered language use, is often been connected with native speakers' well-being. But this is something that linguists and other policymakers have started to look into seriously only in recent days. The first time it was flagged was in the Green Book of Language Revitalization by Hinton and Halley. Hinton in his chapter on language revitalization method tells us that people who are helping new speakers learn the language have actually reported positive health benefits. Their health reports like blood pressure and heart rates have started to stabilize. This is the first time we ever come across this report in linguistics or language endangerment context. Even though there has been some anecdotal evidence, this is the first ever instance of this. So this was in 2001. Since then on, people have taken this issue of well-being very seriously. Health and wellness has been brought into question, and linguists and other policymakers, especially in Canada and in Australia, have taken it really to the core and then have started to ask questions. Now, there have been evidences, both qualitative and quantitative evidences, that talks of reduction of stress and reduction of alcohol intake and drug abuse going down, and positive emotions, joyful emotions, and balance and healthy spirit coming up with the active use of language. And qualitative, there are also quantitative evidences. So these are statistically also significant. Two such important studies. One is from Canada's First Nation youth. Canada First Nation is that the rates of suicide are very high in communities where the language loss or where the language is not actively used. And the rate of suicide is very low. In fact, except for one case in the study, is completely zero where there is an active use of language. So this is a Canadian work on University of Alberta, which clearly tells us that endangered language use or language use has a major impact on well-being for the First Nation youth. And the last one is from Aboriginal languages. Again, Australia, they also tell us a lot. People who speak the language have better health. So people who speak the languages have not been victims of, especially in this context, it takes, so in Australia, if you are staying in your land, then there is a good assumption that you are, it is very regular that you are using your language there if you're staying in your land. And those who don't stay in the land often do not use the language. So for people who stay in the land, it has been assumed, it has been shown that they have not been victims of abuse, they have not used illicit substance, and they have not indulged themselves in binge drinking, that is drinking too much. So this is again a very positive correlate. This is a 2008 study from the Australian Bureau of Statistics. So these two evidences actually now started to emerge, and now more researches are being done on well-being. Unfortunately, whatever I've told you actually has a bias. All of this are either from the perspective of Europe, North America, Australia, or New Zealand. So the reduction of language complexity, Prosel and Campbell cites a lot of data, but most of the data are either from Australian languages or from the North American languages, North American Indian languages. It is because of a fact that we do not theorize what we do. That is one thing is there. And we also do not work on a lot of these languages. So we really don't know whatever I discuss as the phenomena of language use. Phenomenon of language endangerment are really the language phenomena at all. So language diversity is concentrated in Asia and Africa, and there's hardly any literature for us to theorize on this. And this is called as inherent bias, and it has been termed by Gerald Roche. So this inherent bias is a hindrance for us to understand both language endangerment and also a hindrance for us to understand what happens to these endangered languages and what happens to the speakers of these endangered languages. So I invite you all to enhance our understanding by diversifying this research. Thank you. And I think I took a long time.
No, you didn't. You were pretty much on time.
Okay,
Thank you, Karthik, for this talk.
Yeah.
We have a question. Sakshi.
Hi, Karthick.
Hi, Shakshi. Yes.
Okay, is my voice clear? Can you hear me? Should I start?
Yeah, I can hear you. Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So I wanted to ask about the this to.
If I may interrupt, Sakshi, will you please type it out?
Okay.
It's echoing. Karthik, now there are questions on the group chat.
I've seen Nupur's question.
Okay.
Yes, Nupur. For example, certain things seem to be common, but certain things are not. For example, the emphasis on literacy uh, really becomes a joke if you come to Indian context, especially the South Asian context. We have a lot of languages which are oral and which have been thriving orally and which continue to thrive orally. But our assessment methods will tell these languages or call these languages to be endangered because they do not have a literacy. Now, even though literacy has a positive prestige, many Indian communities do not wish to have a literacy in the languages. Especially many small Indian communities do not wish to have a literacy in the languages. There are many reasons. One of the reasons that I've often encountered is the moment our language becomes literate, or rather there's a literacy in our language, others can learn this. Now that becomes a very important thing. People don't want others to learn their language. It becomes a very unique identity. So they want to maintain it in oral form and not in the written form. So as Aisha pointed out, so the quota is a language that I worked with, and then this quota situation clearly tells me that the languages are very happy, that the people are very happy to speak it, and does not want to burden the kids with this language when they speak. Actually, they don't want their kids to learn a new writing system and then write this language. Even though there is a literacy available, there is a symbolic literacy available. A person in the Kota community has developed a writing system. People are not using it, but people are very happy to have it in a spoken form. And one more often important things that we take for granted is that if your land rights are protected, for example, Canadian and Australian examples keep on repeating to you that for an active use of language, you need to have land right for the community. Now, the Kota is a Dravidian language spoken in the Nilgiri district. In that language, what I find is that their land rights were not absolutely protected. The moment the colonials went away, they were thrown to the dogs. Their traditional patterns of economy was broken, and they were literally left on the open to fend for themselves. And the land right had no role in Kota's socio-economic development. They became a very prosperous community today within the Nilgiri tribal standards, based on their educational development. And again, one more thing that I said, if a community is very well educated and if there are a lot of graduates in the community, the language is not used. Kota again bursts that myth. There are a lot of literates, and there's high literacy in Kota community. There are a lot of doctors and engineers and even an IAS officer and IPS officer, and this language is not lost. So this is again proving to be a challenge to the existing idea that endangered languages needs to be in isolation. Endangered languages need to be in. They need to have their economic rights protected and all these things. So it is again not a myth, but again the data is telling us something new, that it is not. That something other than these things are also in effect. For example, land rights do not play effect. Contrast to Kota, another language that I studied with, or Toda. This is a community whose land right is absolutely protected. If you go to Nilgiris, the top of Nilgiris, half of the land that you see belong to this community called Toda. So their land right is protected, their economic activity is not really protected, but since the land is protected and they are in their land, it is expected that they should have their language protected, and then there should be continuity in language. But what I see, or what the PhD research tells me, is that no, there is a greater intergenerational disruption. Intergenerational transmission is disrupted in Toda rather than Kota. So certain European standards like protection of land rights, high literacy leads to endangerment. All these things are actually not really holds true to us. And similarly, literacy also doesn't hold true to us for most cases. So, does this answer the non-Enan thing, or is it too long and too incomprehensive?
Yeah, totally. Like I would have. Oh, sorry.
Yeah. No issues.
Karthik, another question?
Yeah, I've seen it. To begin with, yes, a lot of localization or rather subjectivity is seen in endangered language assessment. Now, do we need objective assessment is a real question, is a really important question. But what do we need objectivity for is also another question. Why do we need to have this universally quantifiable objective notions when the context in which the language is used is radically different from one another? So this actually leads to the question on the basic metaphor that we use to conceptualize the language. Do we really need to stick to this metaphor of living organism for us to understand language endangerment as a phenomena? I think it is wise for us to move away from it, or rather use something in addition to it. It is this sticking to this metaphor of body, or rather a living organism, is that I am looking for this question of subjectivity and objectivity. I would rather want, or rather, I would want to create an assessment method that focuses a lot on the regional complexities, on the local complexities, rather than on the universal things. So the moment I start focusing on the regional and local complexities, then I can start delivering better results for the communities that I work with. So that is something that I really appreciate. If I have, for example, communities are more interested in encouraging their kids learning how to sing and speak. So why should I enforce an idea of literacy on them when they do not want to do that? So that's my understanding of this. So I would rather say objectivity, or rather strong adherence to objectivity, doesn't really help us see the problem clearly when it comes to language endangerment. And probably we can also have really objective standards when we understand really more about endangered languages from a broader perspective, and especially when we get rid of this regional biases. Does it answer, Ritesh? And one thing that I forgot to tell, since Nupur has pointed out, multilingual context is something that most of the Inan perspectives doesn't take into account. For example, Kota really followed a domain specification, or what I call what Professor Rajeshwari Pandari, a social linguist of Indian origin, but working in America, called as domain transparency. Their domains need to be transparent. If a Kota has to speak, the Kota has to speak Kota in the home. So the Kota is a community name or the language name. They can't speak any other language. This domain transparency, or rather assigning specific functions to specific language, is strictly adhered to, and the moment you violate it, people really take it as offensive. So this is something that we see in a lot of Indian languages, and only UNESCO takes this into account, but they don't give a lot of importance to that value, because UNESCO doesn't give importance to any vitality. So I would rather propose a slight modification to UNESCO's vitalities, where I decide the weightage based on local conditions and not on the universal conditions. So multilingualism does create a very different pictures of endangered languages. So this question on the suicide rates being compared in the Canada. So I had to give a brief about the Canadian history on suicide rates in indigenous youths. The first thing is that Canada from early 2000 onwards have started to see a lot of variation, or rather a lot of started to see a lot of variation in the data in terms of suicide rates in indigenous communities. Now, all of these are minority communities. All of their lands have been taken away. All of them have been subjected to the same forms of colonial oppression. But within that, certain communities seem to do well, and certain communities seem to do bad on the indicator of suicide rates. Now, Canadian government first started to assess this situation through various socioeconomic parameters, and then they also started to given a lot of intervention to these people, like psychological counseling and a lot of stuff. But suddenly, especially the author whom I quoted, I'll just go back to that. Hetel et al. Takes this study from a longitudinal perspective, and then this shows that communities that do not show high suicide rates are communities whose identity are not challenged, or communities whose identities are rather continued. Now, this is also something that is very common across indigenous literatures in English. When you look into them, there is always this fight in the characters in these indigenous English literatures on the loss of identity. So they then did a longitudinal study as well as a cross-sectional study to assess this, and then they found out one thing clearly sticked out for most of the groups. So they looked at settlement level data, not even at community level data. So even though there are communities are spread across multiple settlements. So they took data at the settlement level and started to see what are the rates of suicide. And they found that in the settlements in which there is continuous language use, and then there is a better identity being recognized, there is lesser suicides. And in others where languages are not continuously used in these settlements, there are higher suicide. Now, they did try to factor out other socioeconomic conditions, and after that they decided, yes, language does play an important role. So so there were 6 factors that they took in, and they mixed all the 6 factors with the factor called the 7th one called language. And only after this that they decided that language do seem to have an important role in the well-being of the society. So as I pointed out, again, this is an emerging study, this is an emerging field, and there has been a lot of qualitative evidences like narrations and a lot of people telling you about, for example, indigenous language speakers telling you that I feel positive and I feel healthy, and then I don't often fall sick after I started learning languages. That has been something that is very quite reoccurring in Canadian context and also in the context of Australia. And only recently, or at least in the last decade, people have started to look into it from the context of longitudinal and cross-sectional studies. So these are emerging data, and emerging data seems to be positively indicate that there is a correlation. Is that a causation? I don't know, but there seems to be a positive correlation between language use and suicide rates in the context of the same economic and political problems. One thing that I've come across again, it is again from my experience of Toda and Kota. Toda and Kota have 2 strong differences when it comes to suicide rate and substance abuse. Toda, from anecdotal evidence, again I can only give you anecdotal evidence because suicides in Toda are not really recorded by the district administrations. District administration is very afraid of recording tribal suicides, so they really don't record tribal suicides. And the data is also very sparse because even if there is a suicide, people do not report it outside. They hush and then they bury it, like they bury the information even before it can go out for an external person to evaluate it as suicide. I've seen that there are high rates of suicide in Toda and high rates of substance abuse in Kota. So high rate of substance abuse in Toda. Again, relatively, there is a high rate of substance abuse in tribal communities in Nilgiris when compared to majority community. But within that relative comparison, I see Todas, like anecdotally, because I've lived with them for example, for both of these communities, I've lived with them for a longer time, more than 3 months, and for Todas, I've been associated with them for the last at least since 2014. I've been associated. 2016, I've been associated with them closely. So I see a large suicide rate and a high addiction rate. But on the quota, I see rather a campaign towards de-addiction, which is completely missing in Toda. Toda are moving towards language loss, and Toda is highly endangered in comparison to Kota. Kota, on the other hand, is not moving towards language loss. It is maintaining its language very strictly. So, and in fact, Kota are more socially and economically, or rather, more socially and politically deprived than Toda are. So, in this context, I would say, then that seems to be the very crucial role that language and culture plays in Kota's higher achievements when it comes to educational attainment, and also lower suicide rates, because I don't see a lot of suicide rates actually in Kota. So for my anecdotal evidence does not suggest more than 3 or 4 suicides in the Kota community in the last 3 years that I know them. On the other hand, for Toda community, there has been a suicide as recently as a month back. So there seems to be some correlation. I would want to really look into this more actively, and I want to see if there can be an intervention for Todas in forms of language revitalization efforts. But if I can get a chance, I'll do that for sure. So I hope that answers Hima's question. So yes, in Sikkim, I think that could be true too. Are there any more questions?
Last call for questions. I think that's it, Karthik.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Please.
So it's not my personal research that I've shared with you. Like there are some certain personal research that I also have shared with you, but I also work in enhancing the assessment methods and stuff like that. But please treat this talk as an invitation to work on endangered languages, to ponder more on a lot of things that I've told you, because as I told you, there is hardly any data that we have on endangered languages in India, apart from a few descriptions and lexicons. So work on all forms are welcome. And anyone has any questions, you can ask me, you can mail me. rknjnu is my email ID. So people who do not know my email ID can mail me here. And I think my slides are also shared with you. So thank you. This is my mail ID again. Thank you, and thank you very much. Go offline now.
Thank you, Karthik. And thank you all of you for sticking with us. We'll be back day after tomorrow with our talk by Nupur Asher on closest conjunct agreement, April 17th, 2 p.m. See you all then.
See you.